in Jeremiah chapter 29. We'll look at verses 4 through 9. And let me read it, and then we will dive in to give you a little bit of a context. So similar to 1 Thessalonians, which is the book that we're teaching through right now, the people, it was a time of transition. The people of God had been dispersed. They'd been exiled from Jerusalem to this new place in Babylon. And so God was showing them, hey, this is how I want you to live. This is what I want you to be about in this place that I have sent you. Jeremiah 29, verse 4. It says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts," it's also on your sheets, "the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." Verse 5, he says, "Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, takes wives and have sons and daughters, and takes wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. But seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf." It said, "For in its welfare you will find your welfare. For thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, do not let your prophets and your diviners who are among you deceive you, and do not listen to the dreams that they dream, for it is a lie that they are prophesying to you in my name. I did not send them, declares the Lord." Again, the people of God were dispersed from Jerusalem to Babylon, and we get a picture of what God's people, and where God's people as a church ought to give themselves to, ought to be about in these times of transition. I tell the story a lot because it's a good reminder for myself, and hopefully it gives you a bit of a background of where we're coming from. But we moved to Orlando and helped plant a church there, and we were there for 10 years. And our prayer as God brought us to Jupiter through the illness of Karina's dad, and we were just here frequently and seeing what was going on. We started praying like, hey, we gave the last 10 years to Orlando. What would it look like to give the next 20 years to planting and establishing a new community in Jupiter? What would it look like to establish a community in this place over a long period of time? And what we get here is a picture, we get a vision of what that community, what the people of God should look like and what we should be about. And so for me, even going back, I'm like, yes, this is what we need to be about as a church. And we'll look at three things that we'll see in this passage. One, we have to have an understanding that we're sent by God to this place. Like, it's not by accident that we're here in Jupiter. God has placed you here. God has sent you here. And the call is to settle here, to settle down, to be established. And then the third thing we see is there's a call to seek the good of the place that he has placed you. So we're looking at like, hey, you're sent here. The call is to settle down. And then what does it look like to seek the good of this place? Verse 4 says, "Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles," so they're in exile, they're away from the place, "whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." The first thing we need to know is that they're in exile, and it's God who sent them there. And as I was looking at this passage with Larry and Marshall on Friday morning, Larry reminded us, like, no, they were sent into exile because they were disobedient to God. They were in Jerusalem, they were in the place of God, they were with the people of God, they were supposed to be about the purposes of God's, but they weren't. There was a side note that Jeremiah himself was the prophet of Jerusalem. Like, they would take the most important, the most significant people, the big influencers, and they would take them all into exile. Jeremiah's writing from Jerusalem. His voice, the voice of God, had become so muted that they didn't even look at him as somebody of influence. And so God sent his people into exile because of their disobedience. And Jeremiah, it's a letter of rebuke. It's a letter of judgment. And to be in exile means to live somewhere other than your home. And it's really the storyline of the scriptures. God created Adam and Eve, and they lived in the garden. They were with God, and they would be about his purposes. And what happened? They sinned, they turned from God, and he sent them out of the garden. You see the people of God, they were slaves in Egypt. They were wandering around the wilderness. And now they're in Babylon. And it's in this context, even in verse 11, that God says that, hey, I have this plan to prosper you, plan for a hope and a future. I call them coffee cup verses. Like you see these things on, I said, Karina gave me a picture that had this on it. And you know what God's plan for them to prosper and them to have hope? It was 70 years of exile. We often use those verses of saying like, hey, everything's going to go great, everything's going to be perfect. And he's like, no, I'm going to send you away from where you're supposed to be out of this place. And at a core level, to be in exile is really traumatic and terrifying. To not be in a place that you feel like is home. Eugene Peterson has a really helpful book that helped me frame some of this. And in it, on Jeremiah, he said, in this idea of exile, he says, our sense of who we are is very much determined by the place we are in and the people we are with. The people of God were uprooted from the place in which they were born. They were uprooted from the land that had been promised to them, which they had possessed, in which their identity as people of God had been formed. All of this was gone. So they would have been in the place God had them, being about the purposes God had them, with the people God had them, and then it was all gone. They went into a new place with a new people that had different purposes. On Easter, we talked about this liminal age, or this age of transition, and some of you have looked up and said like, hey, what in the world happened? What is going on in our time, in our place? And everybody blames the culture and blames that. Like, a lot of the problem is because of the church. The church hasn't been salt. The church hasn't been light. The church hasn't been affected in being about the things that Jesus calls us to be about. And so we can blame the culture for everything that's going wrong, or we can blame ourselves and say like, hey, how have we contributed to this? But regardless, we're away from the place that God has us. Not everybody is about the purposes of God. And so there is a rebuke and a judgment. Also, there's an invitation and a promise, and God sending them into exile. God sent them. God made promises to them. God said, I will be with them. And we need to understand that that's the same for us too, that God has placed us in this place at this time to be about his plans and to be about his purposes. It's all part of his plan. It's all part of his purposes. Acts 17 said that he has determined the allotted periods and boundaries of our dwelling place. Like, you're not here by accident. God has sent you here so you could know him and be about his purposes. And his great promise to us is that he will be with us, that he will be for us. To understand that we're sent here by God gives us confidence, and it gives us a calling to be about his purpose in this place. God has sent you here. Some of you really wanted to be here. Others of you really did not want to be here. Others of you just wish you weren't here. But you need to understand that God has you here. He has us in this place at this time. The rest of the passage helps us understand, okay, like if he has us in this place, if he has us at this time for a purpose, what is that purpose? What is his plan for his people? And the passage is really clear. It's to settle down and to seek the good of the place that he has placed us. Look at verses 5 to 6. It says, build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and daughters and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease. The call is to settle down, to build houses and settle down, to plant gardens and eat what they produce, to take wives and have children. The call is to establish a community. When we moved to Jupiter, it wasn't just a call like, hey, we want to go live there and be by family and do all that stuff, which was a bonus. We liked that. The call was to go and establish a community, to establish a people. We're all called to be a part of a community. If you want to be a follower of Christ, if you want to be a Christian as an exile, it's vital to live as a people of God, to be a part of a people of God. If you want to live in a place over a long period of time, as a Christian, you can't do that alone. We live in a culture where a lot of Christians like, hey, yeah, I'm a Christian, I'm just not into the church. But to be a churchless Christian, like it makes zero sense in the New Testament. Like it's not even a category. Because you won't follow Jesus, you won't be about his purposes if you're just on your own. We need to be a part of a community, and he lays this out. He says to build houses. The false prophets was telling them, like, hey, this is going to be a little short-term thing. You're going to be here, and then we're going to head on back to Jerusalem. Jeremiah says that they're liars and they're deceivers. So when you hear preachers and politicians say, like, hey, it's all going to get better. It's all going to get fixed. It's all going to be about what God says it's going to be about. They're lying. Okay? He says there's going to be a bunch of people that don't believe what you believe, that don't live the way that you live, that aren't about what you're about. The call is to love them. He says to build houses. Eugene Peterson said, you're not camping. This is your home. Make it your home. Right? We can have this mentality like we're here for a bit of time and then we're just going to get out as quick as possible. He says, make it your home. Establish yourself. One of the biggest prayers that Karina and I have is we constantly ask, like, how can we stay here? Some of you are asking this question. How can we afford to live here? How can we figure out how to live here? How can we function here as a family? How can we be here long term? It's challenging. Not getting any cheaper. Right? He's saying build houses, establish yourself. He says plant gardens. Peterson talked about that means that to enter into the rhythms of the seasons. It means to be a productive part of the economy of the place that he has placed you. I like this in a very offensive way. He said, you are not a parasite. The church isn't to be a parasite. And I looked up parasite. It means to live off other organisms, to derive nutrients off of others. It's like the church isn't to be a parasite. We're not to just to like go into the culture like, hey, let me take what's good from it. Let me get in there and get right back out, right? He says, no. The call is to establish roots, to be productive. He said, don't expect others to do it for you. Get your hands into the Babylonian soil. Make it better. And then he says to marry and have children, who marry and have children. What would resound with these people is that there would be creation language going on. At the very beginning, God said, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. He says to increase and not to decrease. So the call is to settle down, to establish a community. Peterson said, the aim of the person of faith is not to be as comfortable as possible, but to live as deeply and thoroughly as possible. To not be as comfortable as possible, but to live deeply and as thoroughly as possible. He said, to deal with the reality of life, to discover truth, to create beauty, and to act out of love. To deal with the reality, like live real life. Discover truth, create beauty, act out of love. This was wonderfully insightful. He said, the only opportunity you will ever have to live by faith is in the circumstances you are provided this very day. The only opportunity that any of us have to live by faith is in the circumstances God has placed us in this very day. This house you live in, this family you find yourself in, this job you have been given, this church you're a part of, this place you have been placed. He's calling us to be the people of God in this time and in this place. And if you think about all these different things, they take time. Houses take time. They take work. They take effort. Planting gardens, effort, work. We got one right there. They're having a big thing next Thursday. They have been working very hard to make that look the way that it does right now, right? That takes time, that takes work. Families take time, they take work. The vision for Crosspoint has been to establish a permanent presence. It's not only that just Karina and I want to be here as long as possible, we want this church to be here as long as possible. And we're constantly figuring out, how can we do that? How do we not burn out volunteers? How do we afford for the church to be here? How do we not get burnt out? How can we be here for a long period of time? Not into like the flash thing, like, hey, let's do something real big and have a bunch of people come, and then what happens? It just dwindles and goes. No, it's a 20, 30-year vision of this. And that's one of the reasons that God giving us this property and this facility is so significant, right? We've met in 8 different locations. This is number 9, right? We're almost at double digits, right? So just finding us is a feat sometimes, right? So that's helpful. But in some ways that's good, right? This isn't home. We're exiles. We're sojourners in the desert, right? There's a tabernacle in the desert that was following. But having this property, having a piece of land, having a building, it's a sign. It's not just a sign for us, it's a sign for the community that we're here and we're planning on staying. That's the hope. That's the thing. And it's not just for our good, although it's going to be good, right? Like setting up and tearing down, there's some very beneficial things to it. I like hanging out with everybody, right? But doing it like 85-degree heat was just another reminder, like, yeah, this is hard. And when we got there, we tried to plug in the speakers, and like, oh yeah, that cord doesn't work here. What do we do? Thankfully, MacGyver Marshall fixes it, right? So we're getting by. But having it just a place to come and for us to gather and for us to be together as a community, it's going to change everything about the church. But it's not just for us. It's for the good of our community. It's for the good of others. It's for the good of the community that God has placed us in. And so the call is to establish a community, and having a permanent presence, having a facility is going to help us do that. It's going to be the good of us and the good of Jupiter. And that's the last point of what we're supposed to be about. It says, seek the good of the city. Kind of repeats this word, prosperity and welfare, and it's the same word over and over again. It says, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Welfare means the peace and the prosperity. It says to prosper, to prosper. It's the word for shalom. It's the same, shalom, 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 shalom. It means peace. It means wholeness. Peterson said it's a dynamic, vibrating health of a society. To infuse the culture, to infuse the world with God's love and God's life. When it says to seek the good of your city, it means to throw yourself into it. How can I help this place flourish? There's various responses that the church has to the world, right? A lot of people want to fight it. We see this most in the political realm. We're going to fight. Some just want to flee it. Like, let me just be as far away from it as we can. Again, kind of the parasite thing. We're just going to and kind of take what we need and then get right back out. Others are formed by it. We just become just like it. That's not what the call is. He never calls them like, hey, I want you to be a Babylonian. He never says that. He's like, I want you to be the people of God in Babylonia, in Babylon. The call is to bless it. He's saying, be holy, be distinct, yet be for the good of the city. Be for the good of the community. And then he says, pray for it. And he says, pray for its prosperity. Now, I got stuck on that this week. Babylon had come in, attacked them, conquered Jerusalem, and then took them back to Babylon. This is what's going on, all under God's command. Okay? You got some stuff to work out in your head on that one. But that God's like, hey, I did this. And he said, I don't want you just to pray for yourselves in Babylon. He says, I want you to pray for Babylon. I want you to pray for the people that came and overtook the land and brought you back into exile. I want you to pray, I want you to pray for their good, for their flourishing, for their prosperity. That's Christianity apart from every other religion. Jesus says something about loving your enemies, praying for those who persecute you. Pray for its flourishing. Peterson said, find the center, in this call to prayer, find the center in which God's will is being worked out, okay? Find the center in which God's will is being worked out in this place. He said, that's what we do when we pray. And he says, and work from there. Find the center of where God is at work and work from there, okay? So we've been here for 6 years. I've been to all the fields, the flag football fields, the soccer fields, the lacrosse fields, the basketball courts. What else do we play? Golf courses, everywhere. I've been to all the fields. We've been to the beaches. I've been on the boats. I've been in the gyms. We've been in schools. And God is at work in all of it. Okay? He's at work, all those areas. But it was when I walked into this place at the Edna Renner Center, I was like, oh, well, that's where God's at work. That's where I tangibly felt in a deep way that God's will is being worked out here. It's a space that was created for the outcast, for the people. I was just talking and explaining. They're like, well, how much does it cost? And it was like, well, it doesn't cost the kids anything. They created a place for 120 kids to come and be and get tutoring, and they call this place the backyard because many of the kids don't have a backyard. This is their backyard, and they play back there. And there's mentoring, and most of the parents are working multiple jobs, and most of the families have. They said there's a lot of times that they would own 2 houses, and when the prices went up, the neighbors would sell one house so that each family could have money, and then they would move in together. And so a lot of times the kids don't have rooms for themselves. And this is a place that people come and they get invested in, and they get loved, and they get mentored. God's will is being worked out here. So yes, I'm excited about the property over there, but I'm really excited that we're next door to this, because we're going to continue to say, how do we come alongside what God is doing in and through this place and serve this community? How do we seek the good of the city through here? We always ask, and I'll close with this, like, what motivates to life? What helps us understand that God sought us? What helps us to understand that God wants us to settle down? What compels us to seek the good of a place? And if you've been around a Crosspoint at all, you know the answer is always Jesus. The mission of the church, that we would point our community to Jesus Christ. So if I'm not doing that when I'm preaching, then like we've missed the mission. That Jesus does. Right? Jesus was sent by the Father. For God so loved the world that he sent his only son. And he sent his son to a broken world, a dark world, a suffering world, a world in need of compassion. And Jesus settled in and he lived among us. John 1 says it literally that Jesus tabernacled. He made his home here. He lived among us. He didn't just live among us just to show us how to give a good life, although he did. He lived among us to literally for us, right? To live the life we couldn't live. And he ultimately sought our good by sacrificing his good. He gave up his life. He died on a cross. He takes our sin. He takes our burden. He takes our struggle. And he resurrects and he gives us new life. What compels us to be sent? Jesus was sent for us. What allows us to settle in a place that is not our home? Jesus left heaven to settle here on earth. What compels us to seek the good of a place that people are our enemies? We were enemies of God. And Christ died for us. That compels us. That drives us. We'll close with this. Peterson said, all of us are given moments, we're given days, we're given months, we're given years of exile. Basically, our whole life is one of exile. That's why the lie of like, hey, it's going to get better or easier. Jeremiah said, they're not from God. What will we do with them? Would we wish we were someplace else? Will we complain? Will we escape into fantasies? Will we drug ourselves into oblivion? I'm not just talking about like taking drugs. I'm talking to anything that you use to numb yourself. Or will we build and plant and marry and seek the shalom or the good of the place we inhabit and the people we are with? Exiles reveals that what really matters and frees us to pursue what really matters, which is to seek the Lord with all of our hearts and pursue his plans and his purposes. That's why this space matters. It allows us to establish a community, to be a community that's not just for ourselves, but it's for the good of this place. To build, to plant, and to seek the shalom of this community.